Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Bai Xiaochun's eyes lit up. Although he hadn't detected the essence aura, his cultivation base had surged, and his time immemorial codex had automatically become active. Clearly, this world was to him like sweet dew to a parched traveler, and it instantly caused his heart to begin pounding. However, after what had developed with the old ghost woman, he was completely on guard against any type of danger, and would definitely not act rashly. The first thing he did was send out his divine sense to simply observe the hourglasses that made up the world. As he did, his expression flickered, and eventually, a look of dumbstruck awe filled his face. "Hey, little automaton, look at that world. Can you see that one particularly strange area?" By this point, Bai Xiaochun had mostly recovered from his earlier shock. After looking down at the world, he found the area Bai Xiaochun had referred to, and yet, couldn't see it any clearer than Bai Xiaochun could. However, there were fluctuations coming from it that seemed incredibly powerful. Bai Xiaochun also sensed the fluctuations, and they caused his entire body to thrum. Sovereign aura. There's a sovereign aura there. Bai Xiaochun and Bai Xiaoqi shared a shaken glance. At the same time, Bai Xiaochun was already coming up with some speculations about what was happening. I wonder if this sunken area within the void is actually an enormous hourglass. And that world is the middle of the hourglass. And maybe that strange area is actually the other half of the hourglass. If I'm right, then this hourglass must be the precious treasure of a sovereign. And it's currently ownerless. The mere thought caused his eyes to shine brightly, and his heart to race. With that, he flew off of the fan with the intention of circling the area a few times, trying to see if he could take the precious treasure that was this hourglass with him. Bai Xiaoqi's eyes immediately went wide. "Don't cause any more trouble, Bai Xiaochun. This is probably a magical item similar to me. And it's not damaged or incomplete. If you piss it off, we're both finished." Clearing his throat, Bai Xiaochun replied with the usual, "Don't worry, I have plenty of experience with this kind of thing." Bai Xiaoqi's mind instantly began to spin as he realized that Bai Xiaochun had said this exact same thing before. Then he realized what Bai Xiaochun meant by having experience in this specific situation, and his eyes began to burn with anger. However, after a moment, he breathed a sigh of relief as he realized that Bai Xiaochun would really have no way of successfully taking the hourglass. As for Bai Xiaochun, he was feeling very distressed about the situation. After all, the hourglass was different from the damaged fan. The only reason he had successfully acquired the fan was because it was damaged, whereas this hourglass wasn't harmed in any way. Obviously, it was a precious treasure that would surely have its own spirit automaton. And since it wasn't a legacy item, it couldn't be taken by force except by someone with the power of a sovereign. Not willing to give up so easily, he put some thought into the matter and then produced his turtle walk. However, not even performing a spirit enhancement on it seemed to do anything. Eventually, he realized what the problem was. It wasn't that spirit enhancements didn't work on the hourglass. Rather, it was simply too powerful. Performing a one-fold spirit enhancement on it wouldn't do anything, and if he tried to perform more enhancements, it could provoke the wrath of the hourglass's spirit automaton. When Bai Xiaoqi realized what he was doing, he shouted, "Stop it! Stop it! Listen to me, Bai Xiaochun. That precious treasure's spirit automaton is asleep. If you perform spirit enhancements and wake it up, we're both doomed." Bai Xiaochun hesitated for a moment as he analyzed the situation. Eventually, he came to the conclusion that trying to force spirit enhancements onto the hourglass could very likely incite a deadly storm of consequences. After some more hesitation, he sighed and abandoned the idea. However, he still wasn't ready to give up. Meanwhile, Bai Xiaoqi was on the verge of weeping. Over the years, living with Bai Xiaochun had been too nerve-wracking. No, too dangerous. Back when Bai Xiaoqi had been alone on the fan, he had never encountered any problems. But with Bai Xiaochun, he faced one danger after another. The old paper woman was bad enough. If they ended up having a precious treasure filled with the essence of time trying to chase them down and kill them, well, Bai Xiaoqi didn't see how he could take it. "I can't handle this. Sometimes this bastard is a coward, and sometimes he's a psycho. I have to think of a way to distract him, otherwise he's going to end up pissing off that precious treasure." His eyes turned up in thought for a long moment and then lit up. "My lord, look, that world of hourglasses is definitely the best place to gain enlightenment of the essence of time. It would be really beneficial for you to do that. Besides, I noticed before that the technique you cultivate has something to do with the essence of time. This place is basically a holy land for you. Aren't you stuck in a bottleneck with your flame conjuring? If you gain some enlightenment of the essence here, it will probably help you break through that bottleneck. Since the spirit automaton is asleep, it's the perfect time. After all, once it awakens, you won't have the same chance again. Don't worry, my lord, I'll stand as Dharma protector for you. I won't let anything dangerous happen while you're seeking enlightenment. Worried that Bai Xiaochun wouldn't trust him, he unleashed his divine sense in dramatic and potentially harmful fashion, causing the fan's detection and defense abilities to surge into action. Bai Xiaochun's suggestion actually made sense to Bai Xiaochun. That was especially so considering that his time immemorial codex seemed to be leaping with anticipation. And he was in a bottleneck with his 27-colored flame. After taking another look at the hourglass, he decided that gaining some enlightenment would probably make it easier to acquire it for his own. And even if he didn't, he would at least come out with some level of benefit. Having reached this point in his train of thought, and seeing that Bai Xiaochun was really going all out, he sighed and gave the spirit automaton a nod of approval. After sending out his own divine sense one more time to make sure that nothing was amiss, he flew toward the hourglass world. At this point, Bai Xiaochun finally breathed a sigh of relief. At the same time, he mused that being with Bai Xiaochun in situations like this was potentially life-threatening. Meanwhile, Bai Xiaochun was getting closer and closer to the hourglass world. Nothing was opposing his approach though, so soon, he was descending into the world itself. As he did, his expression flickered as he realized that the flow of time was completely different. In fact, it seemed that time flowed differed even within different areas of the world. In some places, it slowed nearly to a standstill. In other places, it was to his shock that he realized that it moved 10 times faster, even 100 or 1,000. As he moved through this shocking world, he saw the endless hourglasses of varying sizes. Some were tens of thousands of meters tall, others were the size of a hand. Soon, he came to realize that the chaotic nature of time within this world was a function of the hourglasses themselves. Each hourglass had a different flow of time, different worlds, different natural laws. In that old ghost woman's world, magical techniques and divine abilities don't work, and one's flesh and blood become paper. In here, the laws are different. He had seen and experienced a lot on his journey through the void, giving him a much different perspective on life. As of now, he knew that each of these hourglasses contained the natural laws of this world, and could influence their environment. With each moment that passed, he felt more and more shocked. But what could have created these differences in time? Bai Xiaochun stood there, looking around thoughtfully at the endless hourglasses. Eventually, he remembered what Bai Xiaochun had said about gaining enlightenment of the essence of time. My time immemorial codex definitely has something to do with the essence of time, he murmured. Early on, Bai Xiaochun had heard of essence, but didn't understand it much. After encountering the damaged fan, and Bai Xiaochun, his understanding grew. Eventually, he became the owner of the fan, and practiced cultivation in front of the Taoist Tower of Life and Death in the fan face. At that point, his understanding gradually became more complete. However, he still couldn't put that understanding into words. Right now, he felt like he was standing inside of a true treasure, surrounded by essence. However, his comprehension was still incomplete, and thus he couldn't grasp its meaning. It was as if he were missing some very important key. After a moment of silence, he looked up, his eyes flashing with determination and focus. If I can't seek understanding directly, then I'll just soak it in. Taking a deep breath, he walked up to one particular hourglass that was about the same height as himself. Not daring to get too close, he examined it with divine sense, and found that the flow of time within it was 3 times faster than normal. Sitting down cross-legged, he began to meditate. Although this place didn't seem inherently dangerous, Bai Xiaochun knew that it was actually filled with potential crises, in the form of the hourglasses themselves. Some of the most powerful Taoist magics in existence had to do with the flow of time. If he wasn't careful, he might stumble into an hourglass in which time flowed millions or even of billions of times faster than outside of this world. In that case, a huge amount of time could pass for him, with only a small bit of time passing outside. A situation like that might not be a big deal. But what about the opposite situation? What if he entered an hourglass for only a breath of time, only to have a year pass on the outside? For one thing, if he was away from the eternal immortal domains for too long, it could be very dangerous for the Arch-Emperor dynasty. For another, he had no idea exactly how such an experience would affect his longevity. Was his longevity tied to the existence of the eternal immortal domains? Or would it pass based on his local experience? For non-living things, it would probably be easier to judge. But Bai Xiaochun was a celestial, and his existence was profoundly tied to the eternal immortal domains. He had no way of knowing whether leaving his own world for a long period of time would affect his Deoseed in some way, or perhaps damage it. Therefore, he had to be very careful in the choices he made here. Closing his eyes, he focused on the passage of time. At first it seemed difficult to wrap his mind around how exactly it differed from the flow of time outside. But as time passed, he gradually began to notice what appeared to be flickering vestiges of something. Unfortunately, he wasn't sure exactly what those vestiges were. Even worse, there were too few of them. Several days later, he opened his eyes. Although he felt much closer to grasping the key to this world, he was still far from success. Were those vestiges of time? He thought hesitantly, pondering the seemingly illusory vestiges. For some reason, whenever he looked at them, he felt a sensation of bending or distorting. By this point, his curiosity was piqued, and he had already forgotten that his main goal in coming into this world was to figure out a way to take ownership of the precious treasure that housed it. Mind filled with thoughts of the vestiges he had seen, he found another hourglass that had a tenfold difference in time, and sat down to meditate. A few days later, he opened his eyes, and looked a bit confused. There were more vestiges here, and yet, he still couldn't see them clearly. Frustrated, he gritted his teeth. I refuse to believe I can't succeed. Those vestiges are definitely the essence of time. This time, he found an hourglass in which time flowed 100 times faster than normal. Sitting down, he looked at it closely, and then once again sought enlightenment. This session of enlightenment was one of the most life-changing he had ever experienced. He trembled, and even struggled for breath, as he came to the realization that what he believed to be vestiges of time were far more numerous in this hourglass. Furthermore, he realized that the space surrounding the vestiges seemed to have distorted and collapsed in some way. It was as if the vestiges themselves were evidence of some form of a unique, strange power. From what he could tell, that power was what had caused the bending and distorting that he had sensed earlier. It wasn't the power of time, it was some other type of power that he was actually very familiar with. As he probed further, and the sensation of familiarity grew, his eyes shot open. He almost couldn't believe what he was feeling. Gravity? He blurted in shock. How is this even possible? Although there were no magical techniques he knew of in the cultivation world that were specifically related to gravity, there were many magical items that utilized such power. Bai Xiaochun had come into contact with gravity many years ago. He had once offered a pill formula to the north bank of the spirit stream sect in trade, gaining a set of magnetic spirit wings and a proto-magnetic pearl. The old woman who was the peak lord of Irispetal Peak had told him that if he ever got the chance, he could use those two items to understand proto-magnetic power, and thus learn the spirit stream sect's arcane gravitational repulsion. It was for that very reason that Bai Xiaochun had spent so much time following that line of research, and had eventually developed a sphere of gravitational repulsion that could tear the clothes of people around him to shreds. Furthermore, the toxic gas that eventually became his fantasy pill was initially controlled by his understanding of the powers of gravity and repulsion. Unfortunately, his research never went very far, and he eventually gave up. So how could he ever have imagined that, so many years later, and so far away from the eternal immortal domains, out in the middle of the void, he would find the precious treasure of a sovereign, in which the essence of time existed, as well as the mysterious power of gravity. Although there were differences between time and gravity, those differences were small. After taking a few breaths to get himself under control, he once again closed his eyes to seek enlightenment. Eventually, his eyes opened, and he looked even more shaken than before. It really is gravity. I wasn't wrong. He was completely shaken to find that what he had assumed was time, was actually gravity. Never before had he even thought to correlate time with gravity, but now, the two of them seemed to be superimposing right in front of him. What exactly is going on here? He thought, confused. Eventually, he rose to his feet, determined to understand the connection between time and gravity. Mere hundredfold flows of time weren't enough. Therefore, it was with bloodshot eyes that he found an hourglass in which time flowed 500 times the normal speed. After that was a thousandfold flow of time. And thus, he continued to move up in his search for answers. From 1,000-fold he moved to 3,000-fold, 5,000-fold, 8,000-fold. It was at that point that he rose to his feet, his eyes shining brightly. Gravity can change the flow of time. Although he looked excited, the determination in his eyes was clear. Turning around, he found some hourglasses with tenfold flows of time, where he confirmed some of his research. Soon, he had a complete understanding of the relationship between gravity and time. The stronger gravity is, the faster time flows. It was an exciting realization. By now, he had forgotten about trying to find the key to this place and was back in the same state he often reached when researching medicinal pills. Every question he answered led to new questions. But where does gravity come from? Bai Xiaochun had always been plagued by that question, but now, in this strange world, he was absolutely determined to find an answer. Once again, he began to work with the hourglasses. As he searched for clues, days passed, until he forgot how many. He was tired, and his eyes were weary, but he continued to search for the source of gravity. Eventually, he looked over at one of the 300-meter-tall hourglasses, which was where time moved at 10,000 times the normal speed. Back when he had first arrived in this world, he wouldn't have dared to research such an hourglass. But now, in his obsessed state, he didn't hesitate for a moment. Sitting down cross-legged, he shivered as he realized that he could just barely hear something like a voice speaking to him. It started out faint, and was difficult to hear clearly, as though it had drifted to this point through countless years of time. It sounded like a man speaking, except that it was impossible to hear the exact words, no matter how Bai Xiaochun focused. And yet, that mere voice caused his time immemorial codex to leap with unprecedented vigor. Even the flow of time around him seemed to change. Most noteworthy, and most shocking, was that Bai Xiaochun could sense gravity changing because of the voice. Although he couldn't make the voice out clearly, he was convinced that it contained the answer he had been seeking. As his eyes opened, they shone with determination and decisiveness. Blurring into motion, he headed toward a 600-meter-tall hourglass. The flow of time here was 20,000 times normal speed. It was even easier to see the gravitational fluctuations here, and at the same time, the voice grew clearer, although he still couldn't make out the exact details. Before long, he moved on to a 900-meter-tall hourglass. Then a 1,200-meter-tall one, and after that, a 1,500-meter-tall one. Eventually, he was at a 2,400-meter-tall hourglass, at which point the voice grew even clearer. Bai Xiaochun was fully in a state of madness, and was soon at a 3,000-meter-tall hourglass, where the flow of time was 100,000 times faster than normal. All the while, the voice grew clearer, and yet, he still could not make out the details of what was being said. However, by the time he encountered the 100,000-fold flow of time, he realized that the gravity in the area wasn't rigidly set. In fact, it seemed to respond to his presence, a discovery that prompted him to continue on this exact same line of pursuit. 6,000-meter-tall hourglass. 9,000 meters. 12,000 meters. Bai Xiaochun seemed possessed as he crazily selected larger and larger hourglasses. Eventually, he reached a 30,000-meter-tall hourglass, where the flow of time was 1,000,000 times normal. And yet, he was still not able to make out what the voice was saying. Although it continued to grow clearer, there was apparently a barrier in place, ensuring that no matter how loudly the speaker spoke, his words could not be heard clearly. Not unless the barrier were broken. Or perhaps when an hourglass was reached that had the potential to break it. With that vague voice in his ears, Bai Xiaochun continued to shocking levels of research. 90,000 meters. 180,000 meters. Eventually, he was in front of an hourglass that was 240,000 meters tall. In this hourglass, the flow of time reached the shocking level of 8,000,000 times faster than normal. As such, the 3 months that he spent seeking enlightenment there counted for less than a breath of time. Unfortunately, it was already impossible for him to determine if time was truly flowing in accord with his local perspective, or from the outside perspective. As such, the danger he faced continued to mount. If he picked an hourglass where the time differential was reversed, then 1 breath of time for him would count for 3 months in the outside world. Bai Xiaochun was very nearly going insane in his attempt to understand the powers of gravity. As such, once he began to seek enlightenment with the hourglasses taller than 30,000 meters, he was careful to only spend a short time seeking enlightenment with each one. And if the voice didn't grow clearer, he would leave immediately. It was dangerous, but he was making incredible progress. The voice was still unclear, but his understanding of gravity was now completely different from before. Gravity is created when the space in the area bends. And the space bends, not because of preset conditions, but rather, because of my presence. As I near the hourglasses, their time differential changes. If I don't get close to them, the differential remains stationary. By bending space, and by shaping gravity, the speed of time is changed. Of course, the ultimate cause is not me, but the fundamental nature of the hourglasses. They have different structures, and contain different dimensions, and even unique starry skies. Thus, the gravity and flow of time within them is different. His thoughts flickered at lightning speed as he came up with various answers due to his relentless searching. At the moment, he was standing on top of a 240,000-meter tall hourglass, looking at the world around him. From this vantage point, he could see that there was only one hourglass larger than the one he stood on. Far off in the distance, in the very middle of the world, was an hourglass that was hundreds of thousands of meters tall. Bai Xiaochun had no way to even tell how quickly time flowed in that hourglass. However, he did know that there was no better place in this world to attempt to hear the words of the voice. Instead of switching amongst random hourglasses, the best decision, albeit the most dangerous, was with that hourglass. After some thought, he shot into motion, eyes bloodshot as he headed toward that gargantuan hourglass. Upon arriving, he was completely and utterly shaken by the flow of time there. It was so indescribably powerful that without his powerful cultivation base and shocking fleshly body, plus the powers of regeneration from his undying codex, he would likely have been crushed to death immediately. Enduring the discomfort, he howled and shot to the top of the hourglass. Taking a shaky breath, he dropped down cross-legged, veins bulging out on his face and neck as he closed his eyes and sent out his divine sense to seek enlightenment. Almost immediately, the whispering voice appeared, and this time, it was different from before. It was not muffled, but crisp and clear, as though someone were sitting right next to him, speaking. He immediately focused on the voice, whereupon a tremor ran through him, and his mind felt battered as if by enormous waves of shock. The speaker was indeed a man, his voice warm and sincere, as though he were instructing his apprentices about the Tao. Mortal renegade, worldly Taoist, the two of you listen well. What is essence? To discuss essences, you must first understand natural laws. Natural laws form the invisible framework of the cosmos in which we exist. Magical techniques and divine abilities are essentially ways of manipulating or drawing upon that framework. As for what constitutes that framework, well, that is where essences come into the picture. They are shapeless, invisible, and intangible. However, it is only their mysterious construction that allows for all of the countless magical techniques and divine abilities to exist. Essences are essentially the foundation of everything. This leads to another question. What is the essence of time? Well, that's simple. First of all, understand that time and gravity are connected. From an outside perspective, the stronger the gravity, the slower time will flow. However, when it comes to the essence of time, its true manifestation comes, not through gravity, but rather, relativity. Relativity forms the true core of the essence of time. If you understand relativity, then you can gain enlightenment of the essence of time. Remember, everything comes down to relativity. Mortal renegade, worldly Taoist, do you understand? The voice crashed within Bai Xiaochun's mind like great waves of shock. He wasn't sure who the mortal renegade and the worldly Taoist were. However, merely listening to the short speech filled him with unprecedented levels of understanding. It was as if a light went off in his head, as if all of the clues he had gathered up to this point suddenly clicked together thanks to this voice. Relativity. That's right, it's about relativity. Without the outside world to compare to, how could you even know about differences in the flow of time? Bai Xiaochun threw his head back and laughed uproariously. Although there were still some areas that he wasn't clear on, he was now absolutely certain of why he was able to hear the voice which had just spoken to him. That voice belonged to an almighty entity from countless years in the past, who had been speaking to his apprentices about essences. The reason his voice was able to transmit through all the years was because his Tao was none other than the essence of time. And he had already become a part of the natural laws of the cosmos around him. Therefore, the increased flow of time in this place allowed his voice to echo here for all eternity. Essences were innately abstruse and difficult to comprehend. In all of the void that had once been a starry sky, only a few people had ever mastered such things. After all, anyone who could do so would be considered a Taoist master who had comprehended all things, and reached the sovereign realm. Sovereigns were rare, as difficult to find as a phoenix feather or a Qilin horn. Anyone from any group of people who became a sovereign would be the pride and glory of that group. And if any group could produce two sovereigns, none could possibly stand in their way. Of course, Bai Xiaochun was far, far from that level. He wasn't even in the Archean realm yet. And yet, that posed no obstacle to him when it came to gaining enlightenment of essences. Essences were profound and mysterious, much less to mention the fact that matters of time were paramount among such great Taos. In fact, only one sovereign within this starry sky had ever succeeded with the essence of time. And he was the owner of this precious treasure of hourglasses. Bai Xiaochun gasped, his eyes shining with the light of understanding. Now that he had found the answer he had been looking for, he began to sink into a state of emptiness that encompassed both his thoughts and his physical form. He had already seen the evidence pointing to the fact that the bending of the space around him was a result of his presence and its effect on gravity, which also caused variations in the flow of time. However, as he seemed to become empty, his body grew weightless, almost transparent, as though it didn't exist. He wasn't truly being wiped out of existence. However, relative to his surroundings and to the world around him, he was no more. And although he was still technically seated cross-legged on the huge hourglass, the force of gravity around him faded away, and the mad flow of time grew calm. It returned to the state it had been in before he had arrived, a state of relative calm. Within that state, Bai Xiaochun's consciousness remained, and his divine soul seemed to fly out of him and look down at the lands below. He saw countless hourglasses, some large, some small. He saw sand dropping down endlessly. And every time his gaze focused on an hourglass, its flow of time would change. It was an endless cycle. As his gaze shifted from one hourglass to another, he lost track of how much time was passing, and lost track of his own existence. As time flowed in its own way inside the world of hourglasses, Bai Xiaochi was outside. After Bai Xiaochun entered the place, he sighed in relief. Almost immediately, the different flows of time within the world caused his vision to blur, making it impossible to see what was happening. However, he could sense that Bai Xiaochun was unhurt. I wonder how long he'll be in there. Hopefully not long. If that spirit automaton wakes up, it could be a big problem. Sighing, he decided to just down cross-legged to wait. After all, if Bai Xiaochun took too long, he could just go in and remind him not to delay too long. Within the world of hourglasses, Bai Xiaochun's enlightenment continued. As he observed the countless hourglasses and the various flows of time, they came to encompass everything about him. He had no thoughts. He simply sat there, his expression blank as he stared at the hourglasses and committed every aspect of them to memory. Eventually, one of the countless hourglasses that he had committed to memory vanished. Soon after that, another disappeared, and then another. One after another, they disappeared, and those that remained behind sank deeper into Bai Xiaochun's mind. No one, not even Bai Xiaochun, could sense what was happening. The hourglasses vanished one after another, until one day, there was only one left. It wasn't large, only about the height of an average person. However, it seemed to be a part of Bai Xiaochun, a part of his soul, a part of his fleshly body, a part of his daoseed. It had completely fused with every aspect of him. It could not be wiped away or destroyed. In fact, in some ways, this hourglass was like a second daoseed. When that solitary hourglass came to be the only one left behind, Bai Xiaochun shivered, his closed eyes flickered, and he began to breathe rapidly. At the same time, magical symbols began to appear on the surface of the hourglass in his mind. Although he didn't recognize any of them, they all originated within his own imagination. They contained his understanding of time, as well as his incomplete comprehension of essences. They covered the hourglass in the form of magical symbols, and then began to shine with bright light. Bai Xiaochun shivered even more, and began to breathe more rapidly, until at one point, the shining of the magical symbols prompted him to unconsciously reach out and wave his right hand. That simple gesture caused the air around him to collapse, and time itself to bend toward him. Gravity sprang into being, instantly changing the flow of time in his area. Outside, Bai Xiaochi sensed what was happening, and his eyes nearly popped out of his skull. Essence Taoist magic, and that was exactly what it was, a Taoist magic of essence. Although it was only in an embryonic form, only a small fraction of what it could be, it still caused time in the area around Bai Xiaochun to change. He shivered more, and his closed eyes began to flicker even more rapidly, as though he might awaken at any moment. Suddenly, he lifted his head, and regained lucidity, as if he were emerging from a dream. The transformations to the air and the area around him faded away, but everything he had experienced within that dream remained behind. Did I just? His eyes flickered with incredulity as he looked down at his hand. After a moment, he reached out again with his hand, touched his inner hourglass with divine sense, and then waved his hand. The same thing happened as had happened moments ago, causing Bai Xiaochun's heart to surge with excitement. Shooting to his feet, he closed his eyes to examine the shocking power of this new divine ability. I can change the flow of time in a small area. If I had to fight the vile emperor again, I wouldn't need to rely only on Archean luminescence. I could slow time around him, but keep it the same around me. From the vile emperor's perspective, it would make me seem unimaginably fast. Excited, he did a few more tests to make sure he was correct in his assessment. Afterward, he decided to name this fourth immensely powerful divine ability that he had just created. Time is connected to gravity, he murmured, eyes glittering. Therefore, I'll call this divine ability gravitational extermination. Although he had never liked fighting and killing, by now he realized that the only way to keep the Arch-Emperor dynasty safe was to be stronger than everyone else. He needed people to respect him. That was the only way to truly put an end to the fighting and killing. I have the magical symbols of the Sutra of the former. I have the gates of life and death of the Sutra of the present. I have the Paramita lily of my Sutra of the future. And now I have my fourth great divine ability, gravitational extermination. Even without Archean luminescence, I can still pose a big threat to an Archean. Brimming with self-confidence, he checked his cultivation base, and to his delight found that the good fortune he had experienced had pushed him into the great circle of the celestial realm. He didn't leave the world of the hourglasses immediately. Using his newfound control over time, he successfully broke through the bottleneck of the 27-colored flame. After finishing the formula, he rose to his feet and looked around at all of the hourglasses with a bit of sorrow and longing. Then, he clasped hands and bowed deeply. He was offering thanks to the world around him, and to that mysterious sovereign whose Tao he had benefited from. Because of all the good fortune he had received, he completely abandoned any thoughts of taking this precious treasure with him. He knew that until he became a sovereign, he didn't qualify to own it. After straightening up from his bow, he flew up into the sky. When he had first arrived in this place, the chaotic flows of time had been quite unsettling. But now that he had taken his first steps toward controlling the essence of time, they didn't bother him at all. It didn't matter how the time flows shifted and changed, they couldn't do anything to affect the hourglass in his mind. That hourglass was rooted to his consciousness, and nothing on the outside could affect it any more than wind could affect a boulder. Flying up, he eventually found himself back out in the void, and then, on his treasured fan. In that exact moment, Bai Xiaochun settled down cross-legged, and was just about to close his eyes to meditate. Startled, he jumped back up and shouted, "What's wrong?" Sending his divine sense out, he checked the area, as well as the precious treasure that was the hourglass. Meanwhile, Bai Xiaochun looked back at him in shock. Then his eyes settled into a glare. Considering how long he had been gone, he had expected Bai Xiaochun to at least miss him a little bit. Suddenly, he got an odd feeling. "What are you all flustered for?" he asked. "How long was I in the hourglass world? How long?" Bai Xiaochun looked back at him, a bit confused. "Huh? You don't know? You just went in. It's only been, maybe 4 or 5 breaths of time. I watched you go in, and before I could even sit down, you jumped back out." At this point, Bai Xiaochun seemed to realize something. Eyes widening, he pointed at Bai Xiaochun and said, "Wait, don't tell me that time passed differently for you." Bai Xiaochun was immediately shaken. He had assumed that due to his initial steps toward mastering the essence of time, something like this couldn't have happened. "There's no way. Based on what I could tell, I must have spent decades in there. Maybe even a century. But out here, only a few breaths of time passed?" It took a bit of back and forth, but Bai Xiaochun soon confirmed that it was exactly as Bai Xiaochun had said. Gasping, he looked back at the world of hourglasses. Having gotten to the bottom of the situation, Bai Xiaochun was equally shaken, and also looked over at the hourglass world. At this point, Bai Xiaochun realized that his suppositions regarding the outside world had been wrong. Relative to the outside world, the time he had spent in the hourglass world counted for almost nothing. That hourglass world didn't exist on the same plane as the void in which he now stood. It was almost transcendent, and in fact, there was only one word Bai Xiaochun could think of to describe it. "Eternal," he murmured, his eyes shining with hope. The essence of time is so mysterious. Once again, he clasped hands and bowed deeply to the hourglass world. After a long moment, he turned, taking control of the fan and sending it flying off into the distance. Bai Xiaochun was struck by a similar sense of wonderment. However, he was eager to be on his way, and provided as much help as he could to push the treasured fan at top speed through the void. Even after some time passed, Bai Xiaochun was not able to calm down. As for Bai Xiaochun, he wasn't sure what to say about the shocking things that he had been told. They traveled along in peace and quiet for several months, until at one point, Bai Xiaochun opened his eyes from meditation. Without any hesitation, he extended his right hand and waved his finger in a certain direction out in the void. Before Bai Xiaochun could even react, the area Bai Xiaochun had pointed at rippled and distorted, sinking down to become a small-scale version of the precious treasure that was the hourglass world. Bai Xiaochun couldn't actually see it, but he could sense the gravitational force. As the sunken area expanded, that gravitational force grew greater and greater. As that happened, the flow of time there began to slow down. Meanwhile, an enraged howl could be heard, coming from that very area in which gravity had been affected. Strangely, the sound seemed distorted, even drawn out. Moments later, the old paper woman appeared, materializing right into that distorted area, her eyes already flickering with shock. Bai Xiaochun was similarly taken aback, and for the first time, looked over at Bai Xiaochun with an expression of reverence. Not only had Bai Xiaochun detected the woman's approach ahead of time, but he had also created an area similar to the precious treasure that was the hourglass. Although it was only generally similar, Bai Xiaochun could easily see that this was a Taoist magic of essence. In other words, it was a sovereign-level Taoist magic. What are you staring at, Bai Xiaochun? Hurry up and use the sovereign's arm. Constantly being chased down by this old ghost woman had long since caused the flames of anger to build up inside of Bai Xiaochun. And although he didn't want to go out and fight her on his own, it seemed like a great opportunity to slow her down and use the fan's power to unleash some misery on her. With that, he sent out some divine sense, causing numerous beams of Archean luminescence to shoot out toward the old woman. He even summoned an Archean slave, who stepped out into the void to fight. The Archean slave couldn't stay out in the void for long, but now that Bai Xiaochun's cultivation base had improved, he could last for the time it takes an incense stick to burn. Meanwhile, Bai Xiaochun quickly sent the sovereign's arm out toward the old woman. This was Bai Xiaochun's first time making a strong counter-assault on the old paper woman. The woman howled in response, waving her lamp, which caused a sea of black flames to roil out. The fact that the flames didn't seem destabilized by Bai Xiaochun's zone of time influence wasn't because his divine ability was weak, but rather, because the cultivation base of this old ghost woman was too high. Even still, the area affected by his gravitational extermination lasted for several breaths of time, which was more than enough for several shots of Archean luminescence to hit the old woman. Although it seemed as if she existed in a different dimension, and the beams passed through her, because of the zone of time influence, she was still injured. Even as her shriek echoed out, the Archean slave and the sovereign's arm arrived. As they did, black flames continued to burn away at the gravitational extermination's zone of time influence, and the trapped old woman performed an incantation gesture. That in turn caused the black sea of flames to take the shape of a black lamp, which then shot toward the sovereign arm. When the two collided, a massive boom echoed out, shaking the entire area. The Archean slave coughed up a mouthful of blood, and the sovereign's arm was sent spinning back to the fan, undamaged, but currently incapable of any further action. The Archean slave also returned to the fan. However, the old ghost woman was not in good shape either. Her hair was disheveled, and she looked so bedraggled that she was starting to fade out of existence. Eyes filled with madness, she howled, sending more black flames shooting out, creating another sea of flames. As it expanded, the frightened Bai Xiaochun and Bai Xiaochun turned the fan and started heading off at top speed. The sea of flames continued to expand behind them, accompanied by the howls of the old ghost woman. Eventually, so much flame was roiling out that it made it possible to see a different woman. She was beautiful, with luxurious clothing and phoenix-like eyes that contained boundless dignity. However, a black spike of flames was impaled into her forehead, which turned all of her grace and beauty into malevolent ferocity. As soon as Bai Xiaochun saw the woman, he instinctively shrieked, "Immortal Imperatrix." Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.